So welcome to the OIE Final Performance Reporting webinar. We appreciate you taking a bit of time out of your day today to join us. We hope this information will be really helpful as you are completing this last set of reporting to round out your grant period. So as we get started today, I'm going to turn it over to Donna Sabas-Burns to kick us off.
All righty. Thank you, everybody, for taking time. I think this is a popular setting because it only happens once, and so there's a lot of information to share. So I really appreciate you taking the time to do this with us. I will be presenting alongside Sarah, our wonderful OIE Synergy contractor, who is on our TA technical assistance team. I'm sure you've probably been exposed to her in one way or another, delightfully so, I'm sure. So we are going to give you a nice rounded webinar, hopefully chock full of information that will help you towards this last part of your grant project. So with that, we can go to the next slide. All righty. So where to start? Well, let's start with the very beginning of G5. If you take a look, this is a screenshot that is provided to you with keeping an eye on the help desk information. And as we go through this report, always remember, and why this is the very first slide, is that G5 has some wonky hours sometimes. They're closed at various times for maintenance and shutdown. So just be aware of the scheduling, and it provides it there, and it's true to the schedule. It stays true to that. And the toll-free telephone numbers that you may access at any time during those hours to help you if you get stuck. So that's always kind of the best place to start. And with that, we will dive into the report. And there we go. It's highlighted there, the hours. Make sure they're all listed in Eastern Standard Time. That's important. And then the toll-free local time and email as well. So you have lots of different options for accessing some information. Okay, the 524, the ED 52 form are the reporting forms that you are using to complete the final performance report. And this should not be new to you because it's something that you use already for the annual performance report. So it should be very familiar for you. And it just to cover, we're going to go through it, each section of it for those of you, because again, this is a final, you most likely have not done this report yet. So we're going to take you through the different sections. That includes the cover sheet, the executive summary. There are specific sections that require specific information that may be exclusive for final report. So we'll take you through those sections. And handy dandy tip is you have access to the forms online. So you may download them at any time. And there's the link provided for you. So that's the setup of the 524, the ED 524 reporting forms. And they should look familiar to you. Next slide, please.
All right, so there are folks on from all of our various discretionary grant programs today. And so some of you will have slightly different reporting periods that you're including on your final performance report than others. So for NAL, you'll see it's that October 1st, 2017 to September 30th, 2020. And this is just your full grant period, every year of this grant award. For the NYCP grantees, it's from October 1st of 2016 to September 30th of 2020. For PD, the same. And then for STEP, you'll see that it's going to be October 1st, 2019 to September 30th, 2020. You'll notice with all of them, the grant year always starts October 1st, always ends September 30th. And some of you who may be on a no-cost extension, remember that you'll be using the end date of your no cost extension. So if you had a no cost extension that ended maybe this month, and so it's going to end on December 31st, then use that as your end date. Whatever the last day of your no cost extension is, then you'll use those dates, as well as there are a couple who are on some grant extensions or other programs. You're going to use whatever your full grant period is from the first day of your grant award to the end of whatever extension or program you've received. If you have any questions on that, you're welcome to pop those in the chat box. Or if you have questions later, remember, you can always reach out later. Now, as we dive into the actual report, just like with all of your annual performance reports, you'll still be doing an APR cover sheet. You will need a brand new, fresh one. You'll be using the same format that you've always been using. Make sure if you are using these forms, I know some of you sometimes will use an old form. This is one that was updated fairly recently, so make sure you've got that most up-to-date form that was updated in July, June or July of this year, but fairly recently. So make sure you've got an up-to-date form. What you're going to want to make sure of as you're looking at this is that you have your PR award number on here and that it's for the actual grant that is ending. So if you have a new grant, you may be thinking about that PR number a lot right now. Make sure you're using the correct PR number. Also, make sure as you go down that you're going to be using the reporting period from that previous slide. So use that full grant reporting period that we were just talking about from the first day to the last day of your full grant period. Then as we move on to section 8, the big things to remember there are what dates you're going to be using for various things. So you have 8A, which is your previous budget period. So that's asking you the last year. So October 1st, 2018 to September 30th, 2019. Then you have 8B. You'll see that's current budget period. So that's asking for this last current year. So that's going to be October 1st, 2019 to September 30th, 2020. And then when you get to 8C, where it says entire project period, that's again asking for your full grant. So how much did you expend through the entire lifetime of this grant award? Okay. I do see a little question in the chat box about on a no cost extension, how many days after our end date do we have to complete the FPR? And we're going to talk about due dates a bit more in depth in a little bit, but just a quick answer of it is now 120 days after the end of your award, whether it's your grant ending on time or with a no cost extension. But we'll talk a little more in depth about that in just a moment. All right, the next thing to remember on here is to make sure and update your indirect cost information. So if your indirect cost rate has changed, that may mean that when you're submitting your FPR, you need to make sure and include any documentation, but make sure to include all of your indirect cost information here. Don't skip that section. Make sure that for human subjects, you're marking not applicable. And for data privacy, you're marking yes. Those are important ones to make sure and complete as well, that sometimes get skipped because they're down there at the bottom. And then on the back of your APR cover sheet, there are 2 other particularly important things to make sure that you're completing. One is this performance measure status and certification. Super, super important that in this area you mark yes. Because this is your final performance report, it is expected that you're going to provide complete and final performance measure data. So we'll talk about when we get to section A what all that includes, but basically you have to complete all of your data for this FPR. There can't be any 999s or we'll provide it later. Everything must be complete. And then finally, make sure that you've got your authorized representative signature, that you've let them know that this is coming and get that taken care of. Now, once your cover sheet is complete and it is signed, in an ideal world, you will be able to upload it into G5, and that will be part of your FPR package. Occasionally, folks will have difficulty getting that to appropriately upload into G5. If that's the case, don't fret, don't worry with it. Just go ahead and email it directly to your program officer. All right. Don't see any other questions on the cover sheet, so I think we're good to move to your next section.
Yeah, the signature is very, very, very important. It will not be closed out without that. So sometimes that is overlooked on some of these, at least with the APRs. And we will not be able to close out your grant at all without the proper signature. So do please make sure that's done. Thank you.
All right, on the executive summary. So this is your next section. Some of you may have done executive summaries on your APRs in the spring. Remember that this one will need to be different, primarily because the one that you just did for your spring APR was just looking at that last year of your grant. This executive summary is going to be comprehensive. So on your final performance report executive summary, we really want to see the narrative talking through your full grant period. Now, it is a 1 to 2 page maximum. You'll see that in the form as well as in G5. Think about how you can highlight your achievements and your progress. What all has been accomplished throughout your full grant project period. Think about the goals that you set, what you've been able to achieve. Were you able to achieve your expected outcomes? Were you able to maybe exceed some of those targets and outcomes? And for those where maybe you didn't quite meet some of your goals or some of your objectives, providing some information about what challenges you encountered, what kept you from being able to do that, or maybe you were able to accomplish something similar but in a different way. All of that is the information that we want to see in the executive summary. Also think about any contributions that your project has made to research, knowledge, practice, and/or policy. So this is where you really want to do basically a 2-page highlight of your program over the whole project period. The other good tip I have for you on executive summary, I highly suggest you write this somewhere else in a Word document if you're a NAL grantee in your planner, and then cut and paste it into G5 so you can be a happy person. If you are typing it in G5, and if you're maybe thinking through what you want to write, or you get a phone call, G5 can time out and it will then not save all of that wonderful writing that you've been doing. So I highly suggest you type that elsewhere and then cut and paste it into G5. Any questions on the executive summary component?
And by the way, I wanted to mention that we have our program officer on the side, Angela Hernandez, who has joined us and will be on for, especially for professional development, but she is in the chat box. Thank you, Angela, for answering some of those questions. So she's here also, and Jennifer Leo, and we'll talk about her in a little while at the end. So thanks.
All right, next up is your section A, which is going to be the bulk of the information that you'll provide. And this should be a very familiar format to you as far as how you're going to be reporting that. It's going to be exactly the same. But again, we're going to be looking at your full performance period. So what does that mean? You're going to be reporting on both your GPRA and your project measures. Remember, the GPRA are the ones that are specific to your grant program, and your project measures are specific to your individual grant. So you'll be including both of those in your section A, just as you have on your annual performance reports. Really important is the formatting. So for GPRA measures, you'll see in this example, as you look at just this top part, you'll want to make sure to write that they're GPRA in the measure type. And then in G5, the only thing that you have to actually enter is your ratio. Okay, you will not supply a target for your GPRA, only your actual performance, and you'll just do your ratio here. It will auto-calculate a percentage for you. Then you'll see for the second example is a project measure. So you'll write project there, just PROJ. For this one, for project measures, the ones that are specific to your grant, you're going to be doing target and actual. But again, you'll just be providing the ratios for each. The system will auto-calculate the percentage for you. So that's all you have to enter in G5, and it will take care of all the rest for you. So I want to look at a couple of examples of what that will look like for each of you as well. remembering, as we start thinking about your specific data, that those GPRA measures are helping OIE and the department see the progress of your project, but then also of the grant program as a whole. So it's really important to include that information and good narrative for that as well. And then to think about your entire project period reporting, which may mean that you need to pull out some of your old APRs to have that information available, or download them from G5 to have that information available, because you will be reporting your baseline data and each implementation year. Now for NAL grantees, the NAL ED grantees, you're going to do baseline and implementation year for project and GPRA measures. For all other grantees, if you're NYCP, PD, or STEP, you're going to be providing baseline and each implementation year for your project measures, but for your GPRA, you do not have to do a baseline. And I'll show you in the examples exactly what that will look like.
Sarah, I just did want to re-emphasize with the GPRA data, and it's very, very important, probably even on a larger basis, because we do collect GPRA. We're required to take this data. So if it's missing, we will kind of hunt you down and to get it, because it's used to justify funding. It goes to Congress and it gets put out there to help us justify why we need the funds we do. So it's very, very, very important information that we must collect. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Thank you. Now the other piece of that, so we're going to do our data up at the top, and then we're going to do our explanation of progress, the narrative that goes along with that. Remembering that ideally we'd like to have quantitative and qualitative data in that narrative section. So really providing the information on how you've met or made progress toward the measure, because for some of your measures, it's potentially that you made progress toward it, but didn't quite get where you wanted to. If you didn't quite achieve that particular measure, again, providing that explanation of why, what challenges were encountered, what happened, even if it's explaining that for some of you, you may have very different data for this last year because of COVID and changes in standardized testing or benchmarking or some of the programs you were able to provide. So this is where you're going to be able to provide that information about why does your data maybe look very different for that last year of reporting versus the first few years of your reporting. All of that should be included in that narrative. It's really providing the background and the context for that quantitative data that you provided at the top of the page. Also include the data that were collected and when they were collected. So what tool did you use to measure? What was your collection window? Any evaluation methods that you used, how you analyze that data to get this information. And then briefly describe any related activities and accomplishments that helped you accomplish or make progress toward that particular measure. Now, I wanted to run through your GPRA just in case there's any confusion or anyone who's not super clear on which ones are your GPRA measures versus your project measures. So for NAL, you have these 4 regarding language proficiency and progress, academic improvement, and attendance. Now, I'm not going to read through the GPRA for each program, but just know that we will, after this, send out this slide deck so that if you need that information, you'll have it available for your reference. Then for NYCP, you have only 2 GPRA, the one about objectives met and the one about an increase in community collaboration. For the professional development program, you have your 6 GPRA regarding new administrators, new teachers, licensing, completion of the service requirement, and the cost per administrator or teacher. And for STEP, you just have 1 GPRA. So yours is the one about TEA creation. So those GPRA are the ones that you're going to label GPRA and that you're only going to provide your actual data for, not target, only actual. So as we look at an example, this is an example for the NAL grantees, because for the NAL grantees, you're going to be expected to provide your baseline and your 3 years of implementation for GPRA. Remember, you cannot change the wording of the GPRA measure. You're going to be using the exact wording from that slide we just looked at. The only thing that you're going to change is you're going to add in parentheses whether this is your data for baseline, year 1, year 2, or year 3, making sure to denote your measure type. And notice the only information entered was the actual performance ratio. And then this is just a snippet of a sample narrative. Your narrative may be longer than that to provide full context. Now, for all the other grantees, remember for your GPRA, you do not have to provide a baseline. So same thing though, you're going to use verbatim the wording of the GPRA measure. So you can just cut and paste that. And the only thing you're going to add is the year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, however many years were in your particular project. You'll again label them GPRA under measure type. And then the only information necessary is that ratio in actual. And then you'll pop in your narrative down below. Same tip here. I would definitely suggest type that narrative somewhere else, copy and paste it into G5. I saw over in the chat box, Angela pointed out, it's every 15 minutes. And when it says timeout, I often think, okay, timeout, like I haven't touched my computer in 15 minutes. That is unfortunately not what G5 thinks of as timeout. It just means 15 minutes has happened. So sometimes even though you've been touching your computer, it will still time you out, whether you've been typing or not. So just cutting and pasting really, really will help you to be a little happier during reporting preparation. Now let's look at our project measures. For project measures, everyone will do baseline and each year of implementation. So you'll have that in common. Each of your project measures are specific to your individual program. If you're not exactly sure what your project measures were, maybe you're new to your program, you can look back at those old APRs and pull those straight from there because you report on the same project measures every year. So take those, pop those in. And again, the only thing you're going to change in each one is just in parentheses your baseline and each year of implementation. Make sure for measure type that you're putting in PROJ for project. And for this one, because they're project measures, you're going to do your target and your actual. Again, just the ratio for each, but both the target and the actual. And then your great narrative below providing additional information. And you'll see in this other example, you can do that for as many years as you have of your program. And it's really important that you do include both your baseline and every year of your program in this final performance reporting. So just as you're going through, make sure that on all your project measures, you've got baseline and each year of implementation. All right, as we move into section B, any other section A pieces? There is a question about, do the staff that are reading the project objective responses, engaging successive program, also read the executive summary? So yes, all of it goes together into one FPR package. So if they have access to your section A with all of that, they'll also have access to your executive summary. And along those lines, I think that's a great point that you don't want to just write the exact same information in your executive summary that's in the narrative for each of your project measures. Take that executive summary as the big picture, really highlighting those great successes as well as those big challenges, and then provide all of that more detailed information here in your section A, particularly because you're limited in your executive summary to 2 pages. And with section A, while there is a limit on the number of characters in your explanation of progress, that narrative piece, it does provide you more room, particularly because it's getting split across all those measures to provide that more detailed information. And then can you explain more about baseline for each year? Is each new year going to build off the previous? So you're going to be using all of the previous information that you reported. So for baseline and all the years of your program, you're going to want to use the exact information from your APR. You don't change or update that information. You're just pulling it from your previous reporting. So if you need any help locating those previous APRs in G5 to be able to get that information, we can definitely walk you through where you can find those and get that. But it's not something where you're going to have to go back and actually create or analyze data. We want it exactly as it was originally reported. The only information that would be updated is for this final year of reporting. So for your final year of reporting, you may have had a number of things that were 999 not applicable or not available that you were going to provide that updated information. That part you'll definitely want to update, because remember, and that's a really key piece on Section A, is that you cannot use 999 not available. All information must be completed and reported for your final performance report. Now, as you're talking about your information, as you're doing that explanation of progress, you definitely want to talk about how each year builds, how you've progressed across that span of years. But it's not anything where you have to go create new data. It's just pulling it from those previous APRs. All right, I think that's all the questions we had on this particular one, other than the one on the character limit, which we're going to have to look into. All right, I'll turn it over to Donna for Section B, your budget.
Yay. Section B. This is nice because correct me if I'm wrong, maybe you guys have more experience of this particular page, that I think it grows with as you type, because you can use as many pages as you need for that, but of course still do it on the side in a Word doc first. It should just kind of follow along so you can be as verbose as needed. But this is just what it says. It's a chance for you to provide a narrative that describes your spending for the entire grant period. And so again, you're looking over your APRs and picking out those important points that were relevant and poignant enough to share and put it here on this slide. Next slide, please. So you will use that, and again, share anything you need to know about the budget. It could be talking about carryover issues and problems and so forth. So it's used to explain not just, well, we spent this money for that and this money for that. It's a narrative, and in talking about some of the challenges that you had. Some people had trouble getting off the ground. So, capture that in your narrative. Let's see, which one, Angela, were you going to do the next slide, or was it, which one? I'm sorry, 26, 27.
Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry. Yeah, if you can go back to Section C just real quick. I just want to mention and thank you to our professional development grantees who are joining us today. Just a quick background note, guys, that my colleagues that are out in the field as PD grantees, in fact, do see Synergy as new because they've been around and they haven't had a chance to really be introduced to you. And so just quickly, the Synergy team is our new technical assistance support on the programmatic side. So we still have ANLAR and Westat, just as an FYI, supporting the database. But now it's being augmented with some other work that is really more programmatic in nature. And we'll talk about that in the weeks and months to come. But I do want to mention to the PD grantees specifically in Section C, the one item I will be looking for in Section C is your narrative, a quick explanatory note that will discuss or describe your efforts to reach out to any one or more of the participants in your program who have as yet not accessed the database system. The expectation is that they are in there, they've been in there, and they're doing what they need to do to comply with the service payback obligation. requirements, which includes providing updates, etc. As you guys know, I won't go into detail about that now. But if you have folks who have never logged in, and you'll know that by looking into the system and checking to see, I will ask you to be sure to note what outreach efforts, i.e. you've made calls, you've sent a letter, whatever evidence that you have that you've made effort to reach out to them will be critical, because that will be a point of compliance, i.e. past performance, that we will take into account for future competitions, like the one I hope to be able to talk to you guys about later this year. So I won't talk about that now, but just again, be sure to describe any efforts, especially if you know you've got participants who have never logged into the system, aren't keeping track, are behind, because that raises some red flags. Okay, thank you. Thanks, Donna.
Sure, I think I skipped over a couple places. That was my fault. But yeah, that section B and section C, again, just for logistical purposes and for prevention of tears, as Angela said, make sure all of that's done. I'll keep reminding you throughout it, just to embed it, do it on a different document and copy and paste. So I apologize. Let me just go back to section B with the budget piece. Again, you're talking about your funds expended, even if not reflected yet in G5 through the last day of your budget period. So you need to spend all through, up through the last day of your grant. Or if you have a no cost extension, of course, you can obligate those funds up through there. So after October 1, let's say if you did not get a no cost extension and your grant is ending September 30th, 2020, then all of your bills should have been obligated before that date. And you can process them. You have time to process them, and we'll get into that in just a minute for due dates, but no additional invoices should be coming through at all during that point. And something to also remind you about with the G5, you could talk about drawdowns. I know, like I said, a lot of you had problems maybe getting off the ground, and your drawdowns did not happen as they should once per quarter. This is what we like to see. And why, and how did you fix that? Was your budget cut because of large carryover issues? And there's nothing wrong with explaining why. These are lessons learned. And talk about how you tracked expenditures. If you had issues with your finance office, or maybe you guys had different tracking devices with you alongside. So just we want to hear about that. So thank you for providing that. Next slide, please. And again, if you had any unexpended funds remaining on the last day, we need to know why. And we've told you a lot that we don't want to leave anything in our budgets. And that's why the no cost extensions are granted normally, because there are some monies left there, and we want to give every opportunity for you to spend it down to meet your project goals and objectives. It's very, very, very important. Alongside the GPRA data, this is what we explain. If they see us returning money back to Treasury, well, maybe they don't need that much. And honestly, it's looked at that way. So it's very important that we spend down as much as possible. Excuse me. And so in this budget section too, you can talk about, again, people who weren't hired that should have been hired, or because of COVID especially, I think that's going to be a big narrative. Offices were closed. It took a while to get set up virtually. I mean, we are all understanding of what's happening. There's a lot of that. So be honest and be open about some of those challenges. We want to know. And making sure that you are taking care of any outstanding obligations within that time frame, because G5 is only open a certain time, and it's not open all the time for you to go and draw money down. So if you have that date, please pay attention to the closing times for those items. Next slide, please. Yeah, and that was that was what I skipped. So sorry, Angela, that was my bad. Okay, going further to the additional information. Next slide, please. This is part of my favorite part of the report. Any kind of additional information that you like to share, and pictures. I love pictures, success stories, challenges. Again, you may have alluded to it in your narrative, in the budget, the executive summary, but this is a chance for you to share and shine. You know what, I've seen some wonderful things come through. Some photos, some letters, I've seen poetry. I've seen a lot of different items that have reflected experiences from as a result of your grant. And I know you've done a lot of hard work, and there's a lot of good things going out there. So this is the chance for you to share if you had partnership issues. I know that there's been issues within departments of your tribal council. There's been issues. If you want to share those things, this is the place to do it. Describe some of those unanticipated outcomes, barriers, because it lets us know, and we do document those things, about something to think about for our project and program officers too, to share. Advice as to educators who are interested in your project. How did your original ideas change as a result of conducting the project? You know, some of the plans for continuing sustainability outside. I know that's part of a big piece of applications, to have a plan for sustainability, and I hope that you're able to implement that. So here's a brief description on how you intend to do that. That would be something you could add as well. Next slide, please.
And one quick tip on section C, there was actually a question in the chat box about, can you do this via attachment? And yes, sections B and C can be done via attachment. You would still need to use the Ed 524 form. So you would go to that website and download those and put your information into that Ed 524 form. The nice thing about doing section C in particular as an attachment is you can type all your information, but like Donna said, a lot of you will include wonderful photos of things going on in your program or newspaper clippings, things like that. That can be a little challenging to add in if you're not doing it via attachment. I also encourage you not to upload each photo as a separate attachment into G5. It tends to freak out and then just kick you out for a bit. So my suggestion is download that Ed 524 form, type in your great narrative, add in those pictures, and then PDF the whole thing. Make it one PDF document, and then you're only uploading and attaching that one PDF document for all of section C. And G5 handles that much better. It is much less likely to freak out. It's much more likely to just upload it and play nicely with you and let you move on to the next piece of your report. The other tip is, while the photos are great and everyone enjoys seeing them, a 50 photo album will not upload. It will not be able to handle that large of a document. Typically about 10 photos, I say, is a good rule of thumb. And particularly if you're including that all as in one PDF, it can handle that. It's not going to be a dilemma. But just be aware that if you do a whole photo album in there, it will not be able to handle it. There is not a specific page limit in that area. It's more of a file size limit. We'll have to check on the exact file size with G5 as far as what that is, but it is pretty chunky because you are able to do a fairly large PDF into there. Just be a little hesitant on more than about 10, 15 photos. But if you upload it as one PDF, it tends to really do a lot better with that.
There's a question in there about a link to a Facebook page. Have you seen those, Angela, in any of your reports?
A link to a Facebook page? No,
For photos or
Yeah.
or anything like that? Is that allowed? Do you know?
Facebook is, yeah, we do have access to that.
Yeah, I have seen folks who've included like a link to a program web page.
That's a great idea.
To a program resource that was developed as part of their project. You'll just want to make sure that it's the full web link because it doesn't always upload as clickable. So if you're trying to use some sort of shortened connection that way, that won't always come through real nicely. But if you make sure you include the full web link, that should work just fine.
That's a great idea. Thanks, John. All right. Next slide. This is important reminders as we go through the process that please understand G5 is not yet open for reporting yet. You will be notified as soon as it's open and given your deadline for report entry. I'm going to say this, don't hold me to it. However, it is with expectation that we'll have it up by December 18th. But that's not in writing, but that's what we're hoping for. So again, you will be notified either through email from your program officer or from a notice in G5 when it is open. Again, only the grant project director on record in G5 may submit the report. If you know this has changed, then please reach out to your program officer and make sure that those items, that those changes have been made prior, because it is only the grant project director listed in G5 that can submit that report. And G5, again, will not accept reports after the reporting deadline. It's not something that's flexible. So once it's set, it's set. And so that's important to make sure everybody's understanding that. You will not be able to go into G5 after the reporting deadline to revise your report, unfortunately. Once it's submitted, it's submitted. It's not, until you're done, it's done, it's submitted. So again, that's another reason why you should work offline and make sure it's complete prior to uploading. One thing that's changed, we did have a change in our uniform guidance, and perhaps it's a good thing that final performance reports are now due within 120 calendar days after the performance period ends. That's changed from 90 days. So we've been saying 90 days to get it in. It is now 120 calendar days, which will just count out from when your report is open. That's the time frame now. So make sure that that is new, and make sure to notate that. Okay, next slide, please.
And we did have another great question in the chat box about, so many of us for reporting on our project measures might be using some various standardized or benchmark testing. If that testing just flat out did not happen in the spring, whether because it was waived or chosen by the school district or whatever, you're going to put a 0. We can't use the 999 because that would denote it's just not available and you're going to at some point have it. But that's not true. You're not at some point going to have it. It just does not exist. So you're going to put a 0. And that's why that narrative section is so important. In the explanation of progress, you really want to then denote, this is what we usually use to measure. This is why we weren't able to use it. And that's why we reported a 0. So that's why it's always really important to include that narrative component and not just pop in the quantitative information. So for any information that just that particular data point is not available for whatever reason, you're going to input a 0 and your explanation. Any other questions you might have on any of the pieces of your final performance report? I think the only other one I had seen was regarding the deadline, and like Donna had addressed, that has changed due to the updated guidance. So as soon as G5 is open, you'll get a notification as well as any update on deadline.
Right, so the deadline is not December 15th. It will be 120 days after your program ends, and we will let you know as soon as G5 is open with the ability to submit your final report package. Yeah, I agree. Great news.
All right, well, be thinking if you have any other questions, but as you're doing that, I am going to pop up one quick poll that we do at the end of each of our events just to get your feedback It should pop up in the middle of your screen asking, just was this webinar beneficial for you or your program? And do you plan to share this information with any of your colleagues or with your project team? While you're answering that poll, conveniently located in the middle of your computer screen, you can close that box once you've completed the poll. Then we are going to give you some contact information. So as you are preparing your final performance reports, you may have other questions that come up. We'll be sending out this slide deck. We'll also be sending out that information from G5 when we hear back regarding the character and size limits. So we'll include that information as well. But if you have other questions, please reach out to your program officer. We have the various program officers listed here, which will also be in the slide deck we send out. And then you're also welcome to reach out to us on the technical assistance team. So you can email us at oie@seiservices.com. And we're here to help you as well as you're preparing those final documents. We do ask whether you're emailing your program officer or emailing the technical assistance team, if you make sure to include the name of your grantee and your PR number, and it just helps us make sure that we are looking at the appropriate grant information when we're then providing feedback and assistance to you. But you're always welcome to reach out with any questions, and that way we can help you knock out this final grant report to wrap up your grant cycle.
I did want to mention we do have a new team member. I'm not going to put her on the spot yet because she wasn't prepared for this, but just to call out our new team member, Jennifer Leo. We have not assigned her to a program yet, but she just joined us 2 weeks ago and she's in training, and we are very, very excited to expand our OIE family, and she's great, and I'm anxious for you to work with her. So we welcome Jennifer Leo.
Sarah and Don, I'm going to add one more item because I know it came up from an email that our OIE director, Julian Guerrero, received. And that is, if you find yourself in the undesirable position of your grant program period having ended, and you suddenly learn that your budget office hasn't drawn down all of the funds that they should have drawn down during the 90-day post-period liquidation period, that puts you in the circumstance of needing to request a late liquidation, which of course, we are the federal government. It involves a lot of paperwork. So if you find that you have not been able to draw down in a timely manner, i.e. most of you, again, ending by September 30 or later, are in a position to still complete all your drawdowns by the end of this month. But if something happens that an invoice comes in late or suddenly found, and you need what is called a late liquidation, please reach out to your program officer and they can help you with that process. Thanks.
And we do have one other question. When is the final audit, if applicable, of the grant due?
I'm not sure I understand the question about final audit.
It's a STEP grantee. I'm assuming it is a financial audit. I say we, I can also, let me stop our share so we can see each other for this final Q&A, and I will actually turn it to where participants can unmute themselves. So if you have a final question, you can just unmute yourself and ask aloud or pop it in the chat box. Quentin, could you give us a little bit more information on what final audit you were asking about?
This isn't just related to the STEP program. There's a threshold amount now. I think it's $750,000 that you have to do an audit. So when you audit the final year of your grant, when is it, do you turn it in? Is it, there's a certain due date that you, when it's completed, does it have to be audited within the year, or what?
No, you're not submitting that to us. You're submitting that through the audit clearinghouse. That should be your submission, point of submission. And that really matters, frankly, when we're talking about new or continuation awards, because we check the timeliness of audit submission at the time of pre-award process.
Okay.
So you just want to be timely about that for any obviously future funding opportunities and any existing that might extend beyond the period for this particular grant we're talking about today.
All right. Thank you.
Sure.
Well, I think that might be our final question. We're happy to stay on and answer any others. Our other team member has popped over in the chat box and we'll pop it in once more. Our final survey. We do have a feedback survey at the end of every event. It is super short. If you've taken a feedback survey before, I promise this one's shorter. It will take you approximately 2, maximum 3 minutes to complete. And we would greatly appreciate if you would take those 2 or 3 minutes. We're ending about 7 minutes early, so that allows you the 2 or 3 to go knock out that feedback survey, if you would please. So we've got that over in the chat box for you. And then, like I said, we'll stay on for a few more minutes if you have any final questions, but otherwise, have a wonderful rest of your Thursday and happy final reporting.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us today.